Howdy folks, welcome to Georgia's Smoky Mountain RC, and today we're going to be building the Twisted Hobbies Edge 540 32-inch wingspan aircraft. Now, I already have a MX2 from Twisted Hobbies. It's a 48-inch, and this plane flies beautifully. I love this plane. It's great for learning 3D. It's just a really all-around fun flyer. However, I have to fly it in the backyard, use a grass landing strip, and a lot of times I can't fly the plane due to weather. So I wanted something that was smaller, kind of a front yard flyer that I could take off and land in a driveway, fly around the front yard and just have a lot of fun with. So I've got the 32-inch Edge 540, and I'm hoping this will meet what I need to do, that I can fly in a very small space and just be something I can fly when I normally can't fly other aircraft. As long as the wind isn't blowing and it's not raining, I would be able to fly this smaller plane. Now, one thing about this aircraft is the smaller version does not come with a printed manual, so you have to go online and download the PDF. And I know from putting together the MX2, the first step is to lay out all the styrofoam and put something on them to keep them very flat, so that you're starting with very flat surfaces. So I've already done that, so I'm about ready to move on to the build. So stay tuned, this is going to be a great. Here are all the pieces of the model, unboxed and laid out. And there's some keys in the foam that help you to know how everything goes together. And like one side's larger than the other to help to key those together. And there's a little notch on the stabilizer so you know which side's up, which side's down. Here's the profile pieces. So the next step, it says to fold all of the surfaces, the control surfaces, back and weight them down with something for about an hour to allow the joints to be flexible as to save the servos. So we will do that step next. One thing I did notice is that this piece here doesn't have any decals or coloring on either side, which is interesting. So now I have all control surfaces folded back and weighted. I have a nice heavy steel 123 block on the ailerons. A few boxes of bolts holding back the piece on the rudder, and then the elevator, have a nice big heavy battery holding it back. So we will let those sit for about an hour before moving on. So while we're waiting on all the folds to sit for a while with the weights on them for all the control surfaces, going to go ahead and work on the one end of the connecting rods. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use some denatured alcohol, which is the same as saying the little oil lamps, fuel for oil lamps. That's what they call denatured alcohol, and it's great for cleaning the ends of carbon fiber, making them very clean. So I've already cleaned all the other ones. So now I'm going to put the little connecting rods on the end of each one of these. Now they say use something called welder's glue or something in the manual. The manual doesn't look like it exactly matches this Edge 540. I'm going to clean this a little bit as well. It has a little groove on this little tiny edge. So what I'm going to use, which I like using with carbon fiber, is epoxy, 30-minute epoxy. And I just mixed it, so I've got 30 minutes. And I just roll a little bit onto the edge of the push rod, the connecting linkage. And you put that into the slotted part of this push rod end. Then use a piece of heat shrink tubing to go over top of that and then heat shrink it to hold it in place. Heat shrink tubing is really tight. And I'm going to try not to get any of this glue onto the end of the connecting rod. If you do, just dip it in a little denatured alcohol and then clean it back off. And basically you do that for all 4 of the connecting rods. So now I'm done. Each one of the 4 linkages, control linkages, have been epoxied and heat shrinked to put the little rod ends on. And the reason I like using the epoxy when using carbon fiber is because I've used CA and other glues with carbon fiber for different purposes, whether gluing to plastic or gluing to wood, and it does separate over time. So I don't like using CA. I've had it separate too many times. The epoxy tends to hold very well. So I'm using the Bob Smith Industries epoxy. I use that for balsa and for carbon fiber and binding the plastic. It works really well, dries clear, and within an hour or so, it's not even tacky anymore. Within 24 hours, it's fully cured. So that while the linkages are drying and I still have the folded pieces sitting there with weights on them, I'm going to go ahead and glue the canopy on, and that's about all I can do until the glue is dry and the other pieces are ready to be assembled. So I'm going to go ahead and use some foam tack, put some on the canopy side. So for the next step, we're going to start gluing together the wings and the fuselage. Notice that the fuselage right here is in 2 different pieces, and there's notches so that you can't get the wings on the wrong side. The notches are smaller on this side than on that side. So what I'm going to do is use some foam tack, tack each piece, and then glue them together. And you only want to glue the area that's going to be touching, so. So I'm going to glue that side, then I'm also going to glue this side as well. Okay, so then with the foam tack, I'm going to place it together for just a moment and then separate it for a second. I'm going to be ready to wipe off the excess. So when I put it back together, it should pretty much stay. I'm going to wipe off the excess. And you want to do this on, make sure it's a nice flat surface that you're doing this on. And I'm moving it around a little bit because I don't want the bottom to stick to the paper. So I'll hold this in place for just a moment to make sure that it stays together. Okay, so we're going to glue on the next piece. This piece is now dry enough. So again, we're going to go to our foam tack. Put a little bit of foam tack here. Okay, so this side is dry, so we're going to put this next whole piece on at one time. So let me get some foam tack. Again, I showed this once before. Foam tack can also be obtained from Twisted Hobbies. Now for the last part, adding the stabilizer and elevator assembly. Notice that there is a notch right here, and then a dimple here, a notch here, and that lines up perfectly to let you know which side and how it lines up into the fuselage. So same thing, I'm going to use some foam tack. So now with the main body of the aircraft glued together, the next step will be to install the wing spar. And to do this, first you need to clean out the joint that was between the front part of the fuselage and the center part of the fuselage. There's going to be a little bit of foam that needs to be cut out. And we're going to get that. So before gluing in the wing spar with the foam tack, I want to test fit it, make sure the whole groove is very well cleaned out and ready to receive the spar without any imperfections pushing it off of center. So in this case, I'm only going to apply the glue to the wing spar itself. So I'm going to apply a generous amount so that it will be able to spread into the foam properly. So the power system included with this aircraft, it has two types of servos. It has one CSP D14M that I bought in the kit, and has two CSP D10Ms. Now the two smaller ones are used for the elevator and the rudder, and the ailerons, both ailerons are controlled by the same larger D14M. So for the ailerons, it requires the use of this servo arm that needs to be attached. So I've already lightly sanded the bottom of the surfaces around the servo attachment, and then the servo extender, I've already did some light sanding across the top. So I need to line this up just right, get it going the right way, and then I'm going to use a very light amount of two-part epoxy to hold this together, to glue this together. So I'm going to apply the epoxy to the servo arm itself. Just light them out, just making sure not to get any into the gear tooth area for the servo attachment. So I'm going to line it up and center it as best as I possibly can here. Then I'm going to hold it in place, if it'll hold still enough. Right about there, that's where I want it. I'm going to use a few of these little teeny tiny clothespins. Actually found these at Dollar General, a whole pack for $1. They're rather cheap, but they work quite well. And they're nice because if you have to destroy them to get them pulled off a piece of epoxy, it's not a big deal. All right, so we're going to let this dry for 24 hours. Next thing I'm going to do before going any further is to test the servos and kind of get a rough idea where the centers are. So I'm going to use a servo tester for now. I'll set up the radio later. Okay, so that's about center for this one. Make sure you get the arm just temporarily set on so it's closest to the center position, which is right there for this one. Okay, so that one appears to be operating correctly. And that one is going to be the elevator servo that lays flush, lays flat in the fuselage. Then here is, it's going to be my rudder servo, which will sit this way and control the rudder. And the rudder has supports that run down the side of the fuselage and then go to the rudder. So let's see where the center is on this guy and make sure it's working. Okay, so that's as close to center. Make sure I got this as close to center as I can get it. Probably right there. That's as close to center as I'm going to get with that one. Okay, so there's my elevator servo. So So rudder servo will go down in here like this. The rudder servo will sit like this. And then there is the aileron servo, which one servo for both ailerons, and that will go underneath and sit down. So it'll be underneath like, actually it'll sit this way. So it'll sit like this. It'll sit like that, upside down. So let's go ahead and check this one out and see where center is. So it looks like all these were sitting from the manufacturer right at center. Left, right. So that's pretty dead on center right there. Before I go any further, to start putting the bottom side of the fuselage on, I want to go ahead and affix all of the servo arms to the servos. And I've already affixed these two. I'm going to do this last one. Now, basically what I'm going to do is use a very fine point magnetized screwdriver to hold the screw in place. And I'm going to tip get a little very small amount of Loctite, non-permanent Loctite, so it can be removed later on the end of the screw, because I don't want these to come out over time in flight. I'll be very careful to make sure we don't strip the screw out and screw on the servo arms. And make sure you hold the servo arm so it doesn't move when you're trying to tighten it down. You don't want the gears to start moving on you. So the way these should look, this one, the aileron servo needs to come up from underneath. And there's a little piece of a little cutout for the wire. All the wires should be towards the bottom side of the fuselage. So this will slide in here. And I've already cut out a very small piece of the foam right here in the end, so I can bring this wire out from underneath, and it will still sit flush. This lip will still sit flush. And that's how the aileron servo goes in from the bottom. The other two are on the top. So we have the elevator servo is going to sit right here. Now we want all the wires coming out to the bottom. So the elevator servo in this slot. So the elevator, the elevator connecting rod is going to go right here. This is where the horn is going to be. So it's on the top side, and there are some little holes running down the edge, running down the center of the fuselage for the supports for the control rod to go into. And then the rudder servo, also put the wire going in through the bottom. So rudder servo, and the directions are a little confusing on this, but the rudder servo goes in this way. There's a little notch for the wire. It's going to sit in here just like this and come out from the pilot's view. It's going to come out to the left side. And then on the left side of the fuselage, the top part of the fuselage, there are some little holes for the connecting rod that's then going to go to the rudder. The rudder will sit right here, and the control horn is right here. So if you're looking at the aircraft from the top, this is the rudder servo, which is going to go to the control horn inside the rudder. The other side, which is the right side of the aircraft, is where we have the elevator servo, and its connecting rod is going to go down and connect to the elevator connecting horn here. So this is the way it should look from the top. Now if we flip it over, our wires should now be on the bottom, and you need to make sure that when the fuselage and make sure all the wires are coming out to the same side, the side that you want to use to put all of your electronics. I did have this wire coming out on the other side, but I want everything coming out to the left side of the aircraft. So if you turn it over from the pilot's view, this is the left side. So I want all the wires coming through to the left side of the aircraft. Technically, you could use either side, but I'm going to pick the left side for all the controls. So then once they're all on the left side, then we want to take the piece of the fuselage, cut out anything that may be has not already been removed, that needs to be removed, and then go ahead and do a test fit first and make sure that everything will sit flush when this is glued. And it may need to be trimmed up in a few little areas. So I have the fuselage, the bottom side, fit without any gaps. And trying to figure out how to keep it straight, and keep in mind the servos are going to be coming through on the other side, so I can't just lay it flat. So I need a way to make this flat to make sure the surfaces glue the way that I'd like. So I'm going to sit on the edge of the table so where the servos are off the table. And then I'm going to be using 1, 2, 3 blocks to help keep the right angle to keep it perfectly vertical as best as I can. So the next step then is to go ahead and put the glue, making sure when adding the glue, I'm going to use foam tack, and I don't want any glue to be anywhere near the servo areas. Make sure I don't get any glue around the servo areas when this is applied. In the directions for the Edge 540, it talks about installing the the aileron control horns next. And it says you'll know the control horn by the one that has the larger hole. But if you look at the rudder and the elevator compared to the aileron control horns, you'll notice the holes are exactly the same size, so you can't tell that way. Now looking at the pictures, however, the pictures show that the aileron control horns have this little angle in the control horn going this way and this little notch, whereas this one, the elevator and rudder, do not have the angle or the notch. So that would mean this is the one that needs to be used, the control horns that need to be used for the elevators. I'm sorry, for the ailerons. So I'm going to go ahead and clean this up and prepare these, and I'm going to go ahead and glue this one, and I'm just going to use some CA, some thin CA to glue this. Then once the bottom part of the fuselage is dry enough, I will move this to the other side and glue the control horn for the aileron on the other side. Okay, so I've already used my X-Acto knife to extend the slot for the horn far enough so that the full horn can fit into the wing surface. And then I'm going to insert the horn. And then what I want to do is I want to look down the hinge, the wing hinge, and if I look down the wing hinge, I should see that the hole lines up right over the wing hinge. So I'm just going to make the tip of the plastic, the very little dimple at the end, is actually going to kind of be in the hinge right to the center. I can help judge where the hole needs to be for the connecting rod. So that looks just about perfect right there. Then when I want to move the wing, remove the aileron to make sure it gets full swing in that direction. It does. So right there should be good. I was going to use thin CE, but I decided to go ahead and use like a medium CE. So it goes on a little bit thicker. So that's exactly where I want it to be. So what I have to do is take it back out. And this medium CE will take a little bit longer to dry as well. Put a little bit on the to cut the end of my CE to get it out of the bottle here. Here we go. Okay, so get some medium CE on this side, a little bit on this side, and I want to get a little bit down into the foam itself. Not too much because this cuts through the other side, and I don't want to glue the plane down to the working surface down here. Make sure I get that all the way down in there in the correct place. So another thing about medium CE, it takes a little bit longer to set up, so it gives you a few more moments to work with it. And that looks just about perfect right there. Okay, so make sure it's it's not sticking to the surface down there. And then it's flush with the wing. So that looks good, and that's already tacking up for me. And we get full swing of the aileron. And I'm going to repeat this process on the other side and doing the exact same thing on the other side of the table so that the servos can still sit flush. I'll make sure it's sitting flush to the end. It's good. So the next thing I was going to do is glue the control horn for the elevator in. And I just realized they have this little piece here with these control horns. And it actually has what appears to be two extensions, and the directions weren't very clear on this, but it appears to be two servo arm extensions that have this tiny little hole that can receive the little piece that connects to the control rod. It has a little screw piece that goes in and has a little slide-on, I guess a little metal piece that holds the linkage onto the control horn piece. So the holes that are in the current control arms for the elevator and the rudder are much larger than these holes. So I wasn't planning on using these, but then I realized that would perfectly fit that hole, and I could also extend the arms a little further for more travel if I needed to. So I'm going to take a look at going ahead and using some CE and gluing these onto the control arms. The decision now that I have to make, though, is do I use these to extend the control arm? Do I need to trim the existing control arms back a little bit so that the little grommet that goes in the back of the fastener can fit, or do I just extend these to provide more travel? And the directions are definitely not clear. They do have a few options that they talk about, but they don't give any specific dimensions or sizes. So what I've decided to do is to use the servo arm extenders, and I'm going to put this on the bottom just to kind of show. I'm going to put them on so they just cover the last hole closest to the servo, so there's enough room left at the end to hold the grommet that goes on back to the piece that holds the servo arm. I'm actually going to glue these on the top, and I'm going to use some epoxy to do this, so it's going to have to dry for 24 hours. So I'm going to go ahead and I sanded the one into this side of the piece I want to fix and sanded the top a little, and did the same thing for the other servo. I'm going to go ahead and glue these with epoxy on both of these, and then give that 24 hours to dry. So now that I have the two servo arm extensions drying overnight, and I have some leftover epoxy, I'm going to go ahead and glue in using the epoxy, glue in the elevator control arm, the control arm here. Just cut that slot a little bit bigger. Control horn is what I actually was meaning to say. So I'm going to glue in the control horn for the elevator with that epoxy. It'll give it a little extra strength. Just got to make sure I put it on thin enough because I don't want to add extra weight. And it'll give me a little bit of time to work with this so I can get it to line up just perfect. So my servo extensions have dried overnight, and you can see they're pretty well onto the servo. And the next thing I want to do before I go any further is put the supporting hardware for the connecting rod, the control rod, because This hardware is really, really, really tiny. And it has these teeny tiny little grommets. Teeny tiny little grommets that can be really hard to put on. And basically, the connecting rod goes through this hole. The top bolt is going to screw down to hold those connecting rods in place. And these little grommets are what going to hold this little assembly to each one of the servo arms. They're going to go through this tiny little hole in the servo arm. And the problem is, because this is so hard to put these grommets on, but just because they're so tiny, and they're press fit, so I'm going to put those on prior to putting the rest of the aircraft together, because if not, I'm going to have a really hard time getting these on with the styrofoam in the way. So the other thing to be concerned about when putting this hardware onto the servo arms is that you need to make sure that the part that holds the connecting rod, that has the screw that tightens the connecting rod, is an area where you can get the screwdriver to it. So for instance, you wouldn't want to put it on the underside of this servo, or you can't tighten it down with the screwdriver. So it's pretty obvious which side they have to go on. So place all your servos in locations that need to be. Make sure that you put these on and put the grommet on in an area where you know you can get to the screw to tighten it up once the aircraft is finished. And this hole is pretty tight, so you can kind of work it down in there to get down in the hole. Okay, so I'm going to install the first one of these guys. Now they have an angle to them. You can see one side is kind of dented in, and that's the side that goes onto the little shaft. So I usually use a pair of needle nose. These guys are really hard. I have fairly small fingers compared to a lot of folks, so it makes it a little easier for me, but it's still, see, there goes the first piece flying off already. Okay, so this is what it should look like once the little grommets are added to the back of the little control rod linkage piece here that goes on the end of the servo control arm. That's what it looks like for the rudder and the elevator, and then this is what it looks like for the aileron servo with the pieces installed. So now that that is completed, I can get ready to go ahead and add the top fuselage. Can add that piece on, but before I do that, I want to go ahead and put the control horn for the rudder on. I want to glue this in to the slot here so that it will be dry in time for the rudder to be installed. So now I have those areas for the servo cutouts cleaned out, and I'm going to do a test fit. So I'm all trimmed up, ready to go. So this time I'm going to add the foam tack to the fuselage rather than, or to the body rather than to the top fuselage piece, because I can see everywhere the glue needs to go. And again, I want to avoid the servos at this time. Okay, so now we're ready to glue on the tail rotor. The fuselage has had some time to dry, and I'm going to use some foam tack. In this case, in this instance, since there's such a small area that's holding on the rudder, I'm going to put the adhesive on both sides, on the rudder and on the airframe. So for my next step, I'm going to go ahead and glue on the motor support. So what I've already done is I have lightly sanded both sides of the fiberglass support piece, and I've pre-mixed some epoxy. The epoxy's been sitting for almost 10 minutes. It's a 30-minute epoxy. I wanted to get a little harder before I start putting it on, so that it'll help hold better, faster. The other thing I've done is I've taken some Blinderm tape and cut 4 pieces that are about a little less than ½ inch wide by about an inch and a half long that I'm going to be using to support this piece. Now, the directions say that to use the Blinderm tape, and I've been told that you don't necessarily have to, but I want the extra support. And I'm also going to epoxy this on. I'm not going to use any other type of glue because I want this to be a nice permanent bond. And I think epoxy is the best way to go. So I've got everything ready. I also have 4 push pins that are going to be used to help center this once we get the glue on there, so that it stays centered exactly where I want it. And then these will only be applied after the Blinderm tape is applied. Now, I thought with the Blinderm tape being in the directions that maybe they would have included some with the kit. And I looked everywhere, there wasn't any. I checked with them and they said, no, you don't necessarily have to use it. It's optional. So I went ahead and ordered some. So the first thing I'm going to do is apply the adhesive to the aircraft itself. And make sure I cover about the area where this is going to be located. So up to right about where the edge starts to turn. Okay, first piece of Blinderm tape. I'm going to tape the top where I've put the glue. Make sure I push that down really good and wipe away a little bit of this excess. Okay, next piece. Right across here. Okay, next piece. And I will do the final working on this to make sure everything lines up and is smoothed out just right once I get the other side done. I want to flip this over, get the other side working. So a little more epoxy. So now that the motor mount is nice and dry, and the Blinderm tape has dried as well and cured with the epoxy that we applied there. So the next step, what we want to do is go ahead and use the self-tapping screws. In this case, this motor mount already has pre-drilled holes in the motor mount itself. So I want to go ahead and take the self-tapping screws and screw through the Blinderm tape that's already in place and into the foam. I want to do this on all 4 mounting locations. So I'm going to take the screws back out, and you can use either a piece of a popsicle stick or maybe a large toothpick and dip it into some CA and take the sharp end of the toothpick and just put that CA right down into each one of the 4 holes. I'm just going to dip just put a little bit of CA in each one of the 4 holes. Make sure it gets down inside there. Seal those threads. So while I have my CA out with my little toothpick, what I want to do is apply a little bit extra CA to the aileron servo horn here. Add a little bit more, add some CA to the already epoxy joint, just to add a little more strength to both sides. Ideally, I could use a little bit of Kevlar string to kind of wrap around here and seal that with CA as well, which would be helpful. But definitely, it's best to add a little bit of CA to the servo horn on top of the epoxy, just to give it a little extra strength to be sure it doesn't pull away. Okay, now that the CA has had some time to set up for our threads, we want to mount the motor. Make sure that your wires are coming off on the same side as all your other wires for your electronics. You want everything on the same side, so your ESC and your receiver can all be set up on that same side. So let's go ahead and mount the 4 screws. I'm just going to start them loosely at first and then go through and tighten them all up once I have all the screws started. I'm not going to put on the prop yet. I want to get all the electronics up, running, and working, and get my transmitter set up prior to installing the prop. When you tighten these down, don't tighten them too much because you don't want to end up stripping out the threads that you've created. So what I want to do now is set up all of my control linkages, and to do that I want to go ahead and get my electronics up and running and have my radio, the basic part of the radio set up. I'll add the Expo and other items that are needed later. So I'm using a Spectrum NX10 for my transmitter, and I'm going to go in Actually, first thing I'm going to do, take that sound down because that is annoying when you're trying to do a setup. So I'm going to do model select, and I'm going to select add new model, create, and model type. That is already set. Okay, model name I will do later. Aircraft type. So now, we're going to go through the different wing types. So this wing type looks like what we want. We want a single servo controlling both ailerons, not two separate servos. So it's not dual ailerons. And it's not flaperons. We want to go with the initial setup, which is a single servo for both ailerons. Okay, tail is also going to be normal. So just make sure that's on normal. And next. Okay, so our model is set up. And we can set up all the trims and everything else later. I'm going to go ahead and name my aircraft, and then we can set everything up with the electronics and get started. Okay, so setting up the electronics, we have the ESC. And I'm going to plug the ESC into the motor, ESC standing for electronic speed control. And the motor direction is supposed to be clockwise relative to the pilot's view. So if you're sitting in the aircraft looking at the propeller, it should appear to be spinning in a clockwise direction. However, if you don't program your ESC, in my case I'd rather use it with my factory default settings, if you get the wrong rotation, all you have to do is swap two of the wires to the motor, and that will get you the correct direction. So it doesn't matter which orientation, which wire plugs into which initially. I will check the rotation once I get this up and going and verify it's going the correct direction. If not, I will swap two of the wires. So go ahead and get the ESC plugged in there. Now I have my little cheat sheet for the receiver, and it shows which wire plugs in where, and it shows that the ESC, that the orange wire is near the top and the brown wire is near the bottom relative to this side of the receiver. So we know that our first connection next to the bind plug is going to be our throttle. So we plug our ESC in, ground is down, the VCC or power is up, which is the orange wire, signal wire data is in the center. Okay, so that has our throttle. Next is going to be the ailerons. So let's plug in the aileron servo next. Again, now the black is going to be in the bottom, which is the ground. Power will be on top. Let's get that one in there. Next is the rudder. And the rudder, which one of these guys is going to be the rudder? Let's see, rudder is on this side, which is this guy. So this front servo here, this front servo here is going to be the rudder. And cheat sheet back up here. Okay, so rudder, again, the black is going to be down, which is ground. The rudder servo in here. Okay, and the last one is, let's see, so we got throttle, aileron, throttle, aileron, elevator, nope, that was wrong. Elevator was supposed to be next. Take this one back off. Elevator. Elevator is this guy. Elevator is next. Then the last one is the rudder, which goes here. All the brown or black wires, which are for ground, all need to be on the bottom side of the controller. All the VCCs are on the top, all the signals are in the center. So let's double check. So we have throttle is the first connection. Next is the ailerons, this connection. Next is the elevator, which should be this one here, and I have to flip it over to verify that. Elevator is on, no, I have that reversed. This side is going to the rudder. This side is going to the elevator, which means the forward one is the elevator. So this is the elevator. I had it right the first time. I was just calling out the wrong name. So this is the elevator, which means this one is the rudder. So it's throttle, aileron, elevator. So this is the elevator. And of course we'll do a final verification once the radio is bound and running to make sure everything is in the correct spot. So last is the rudder. We don't have anything for gear or aux, so we actually have 2 extra channels on this radio. So if we want to hook up some LEDs or something, we could use one of the channels for that. Okay, so everything is wired in there. Bind plug is in place. Let me just set this here for a moment. And then we are ready to turn on the radio. So I'm going to turn on the radio. And I'm going to go in and get ready to bind. So not binding yet, ready to go. So the bind plug is plugged into the receiver. We do not have the propeller hooked up at the moment, so we're safe to go ahead and plug in the battery. Okay, and receiver is flashing, ready to bind. So I click bind on my radio and hit yes and bind. Okay, and we are bounded. Binding is complete. So now the binding is complete, I'm going to remove power, remove the battery, remove the bind plug, then repower. Okay, so we are bound. So this is our aileron servo, and here is the elevator servo. Can't see it because it's on the other side at the moment, and a rudder. And I will double check and verify those. Let's check out our motor. Okay, so that's looking good. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and install, or start installing the control rod to the elevator from the servo. And to do that requires these little standoffs that will go into the fuselage vertically, and I need to cut these off. I'm just going to use a pair of scissors, and these will insert into the fuselage and be a guide for this long carbon fiber rod. So I'm going to go ahead and trim all these off and get these prepared. Okay. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and insert. I'm going to slide all 6 of these onto the control rod, carbon fiber rod. Okay, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and insert the one end into the linkage here, and then take the other end and snap it into the control horn. Okay, I gave it time for the glue to set up, and we have all 6 of the standoffs in there. And I went ahead and centered the elevator as best as possible in the center, and went ahead and tightened down. Don't tighten the screws too much because you don't want to crush the rod. These things are really tiny and you can damage them really easy, but you want to get it good and snug. So I went ahead and snugged that down, and this works. This servo works great. I'm getting full travel out of this guy. So the next thing to do is to go ahead and trim the rod. I'm going to trim it out far enough that, because the end usually mushrooms a little bit when you trim these guys. So I'm going to nick it with my X-Acto just a little bit, and then shear it off with some snips right where I make the mark. But I'm going to pull it out far enough away that there's a little bit of extra room here. And then I'm going to go ahead and seal that by putting a drop of CA right on the end of the rod, the carbon fiber rod, just to help it to continue to splinter where it's cut. And then we'll go ahead and move on to the rudder setup. Okay, so now we're going to work on the rudder control linkage. So grab the linkage here, and we need to grab the other set of standoffs. So I'm going to go ahead and cut out these standoffs. So we have 6 for this side as well. So I'm going to trim the bottom of these. Okay. And now I want to try to figure out where I need to position this, which side that this needs to be snapped in for these two best align with the control rod. So it looks like the first one sits here. So this time I'm going to start closer to the rudder horn this time when I start gluing, and work my way back towards the servo, or forward towards the servo, I should say. Okay, so the rudder control rod is all in and dried and tightened up, and had to bring the travel of the rudder down just a little bit because it was a little bit more than 100%. The elevator actually with the servo extension worked out pretty close to 100% without having to adjust anything, but the rudder had just a little bit too much throw, so I had to bring it down by about 10%. So not too bad with the extension and servo arm extension installed. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is turn the plane over and work on setting up the aileron servo linkages. So I have one of the control rods inserted. It's not tightened up yet for one of the ailerons. It still can move, but it's snapped in. I'm snapping those in from the inside here, and then just, of course, tightening it down in the center. And then, so same thing for this side. I'm going to make sure my wires are underneath the rod because they're all going to be running up against the fuselage, so I don't want them to be on the other side of the control rod. All right, so that one's snapped in as well. Snapping very well. And I need to put that. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to put some tape on here temporarily to hold the wings in place in the neutral position on both sides. As close to neutral as possible. And then I will tighten up the screws and can then trim the excess carbon fiber rod away. Need to make sure, again, not to tighten the screws on the carbon fiber rod too much, because you don't want to take a chance of messing up the actual carbon fiber rod. So with these in a neutral position, I can then go ahead and tighten these up with this centered. And then I'm going to trim these out, trim them out about here. Again, I'm going to nick them with my blade, probably about this far out, and nick it on both sides really well. Then use the snips to snip it off on each end, and then again put a little bit of CA on the mushroomed end just to make sure it doesn't continue to splinter after that. Okay, I've got them tightened down. Both the elevator control, or aileron control rods are tightened down and trimmed off with a little bit of CA on the mushroomed ends. These are a little bit thicker than the other control linkages, so they mushroomed a lot more. Okay, so now that all the control linkages are set up, centered, and adjusted properly, it's time to go ahead and glue the servos in so that we can start putting these other support pieces in that are going to be covering the servos up. So I'm going to go ahead and glue the servos in now. Just a few little pieces of foam tack here and there just to hold them into position. Should be fine. So there's a separate landing gear manual, and it says that the landing gear should be installed 100 millimeters from the front of the plane. And if you look, there's a cutout area in the styrofoam for the landing gear just under the aileron servo. The only problem is it's not 100 millimeters back, so I'm assuming the manual is wrong because this is pre-cut. And this makes more sense because it's closer to the center of gravity. Otherwise, it would put too much weight on the front of the aircraft, being 100 millimeters from the front. So this is where this little cutout, I'm going to go ahead and use an X-Acto, cut that out, and start working on installing the landing gear. So looking at the landing gear set, it's pure garbage. I can see why a lot of people don't use the landing gear. It's very simple foam for the wheel skirts and wheel pants. The wheels are not symmetrical at all. They're not going to roll, and the screws that go through the wheels don't fit through the wheels, so the wheels are going to have to be drilled out. And it's going to be a good bit of effort to try to make this landing gear viable. So it might be worth just leaving it off, but as I said, I'm going to make my landing gear removable, so if I'm unhappy with it, I can take it off later. So first thing we need to know when attaching the landing gear is the size of the bolts. So the manual for the landing gear says they are M2, which means 2 millimeter, and I'm going to measure these guys. Let's see if I can get this to where it can be seen. So this is measuring 1.94 millimeters, so almost 2 millimeters. So a 2 millimeter drill bit's what I need to find to drill out the wheels and the other mounting pieces, and also the landing gear struts. These are going to need to be the landing gear itself, it's going to need to be drilled out as well because there is no hole. So width of the landing gear, where we need to drill the holes, are a little bit more than 12 millimeters. They're not exactly the same, but they're both sides are pretty close. So I have determined that I'm going to use 6.31 millimeters as my distance to come in from one side and from the bottom. I've already scored these, and I'm going to start them with a hand drill. I'm going to put my 2 millimeter bit into the hand drill and start with the hand drill. Being carbon fiber, the hand drill is not going to really cut it, so I'm either going to need to use a Dremel or the drill press to go the rest of the way, but I'm at least going to start it with a hand drill, and I'm going to go ahead and drill out both of these holes and drill the wheels and drill the center hole in the wheel pants, the part that holds the wheel pants, these two pieces as well. So I'm going to go ahead and drill those all out. So for the wheels, I'm going to drill those out by hand. So with the holes drilled in both ends, we're ready to start mounting the landing gear. Now, the only issue is it has these two little fiberglass pieces that are going to go on each side of the foam to help hold the landing gear in place. And they're really tight right around these corners. So I had to open both of these up just a little bit so I could get them past the corners. And then these will be supporting the foam on both sides. And I'm going to use foam tack because I want to be able to remove the landing gear later. I was going to use epoxy, but if I don't like the landing gear, if it ends up being worthless, which it very well may be, I want to be able to remove it later. So foam tack isn't too hard to get off. But I want to be able to hold these in place while they're drying and try to keep things level, especially when I'm working with both sides at the same time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a push pins. There's two different size push pins. I'm going to use the smaller size, and I want to use these to hold the supports to the foam while it's drying, while the glue is drying. So to do that, I'm going to need to make some holes. So I measured the push pin, and it measures about 0.81 millimeters. So I found a drill bit that is 0.86 millimeters, so that's perfect. So I'm going to drill two holes in each one of these. So I have all four of the push pin holes drilled for mounting these guys, and notice they are not going to overlap each other, so the pins will not interfere with each other when I go to glue this up. And these are just big enough that the small size push pin goes through with no problem. So that will work out really well. So the next thing I'm going to do in preparation is go ahead and start putting together the wheel pants. These will glue onto this strip that'll be mounted right next to the landing gear, the gear struts here, and these will glue to this piece, but these have to be pre-assembled first. So I'm going to go ahead and get those ready ahead of time, and then we can start putting this on the aircraft. So the wheel pants are going to go together like this. And if you look at the cutouts, it's the solid piece first. The solid piece goes first. Then this piece sits on top of that, and then this is the piece that will sit next to the landing gear struts itself. So the way you'll do that, or the best way to do that, is use some push pins. Use some push pins, and there's already some alignment holes in the pieces. So this is basically the way it will go together. So the wheel pants are complete, and I definitely found that CA worked a whole lot better than the foam tack. The foam tack was it was too gooey, didn't want to dry, they were moving around. Using medium CA worked the best because it doesn't dry instantly, gives you time to kind of get the pieces together, and it just was a lot less messy and just turned out a lot better. I did not have to hold the pieces in place to get them to dry. I just get a few seconds and then just kind of sandwiched it between 2, 1, 2, 3 blocks for a few minutes, and it dried and turned out very well. In a later step, we will finish assembling the rest of the landing gear. So for the next step, what I'm going to do is secure the electronics, and I'm going to apply these reinforcement strips. And basically they are beveled. So both sides are beveled, and what you're going to do is run one side, that is the side that is not where the electronics are placed, can have this put on directly, and you just put foam tack along the grooves all the way down, and it's going to sit at a 45-degree angle starting just ahead of the hinge for the elevator, and it's going to go in at a 45-degree angle to each surface, and then the tip needs to kind of get pressed down near the front. And you kind of have to hold that in place until the foam tack settles, dries enough. Now the other side is where the electronics are going to be, and we'll show that separately. But when you do the electronic side, unless the wires are already placed where you want them to go, the directions suggest not putting foam tack on the forward section and then hot gluing it down. So now I'm going to mount the ESC. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the wires from the motor straight over here. And I'm going to foam tack those and the ESC right here to the side of the aircraft. And I've already poked a hole from this corner to the other corner on the opposite side for the battery connection. So I want to get this right in here, and I'm going to foam tack this right in, just like that, and then that allows the throttle cable to run up the side of the fuselage to where I'm going to mount the receiver. So I have my electronic speed control, or ESC as they call them, glued in here to the side, and I'm running the throttle wire, which is also the power supply wire for the BEC section of this. Power of the system runs up to my receiver, and I have all the other wires that are going to tuck inside the side strap along here when I put the reinforcement piece in. So as you can see from this side, this one ends about right here, so this one is also going to end actually right about here. So this is going to be outside of the reinforcement piece. All these wires are going to be tucked in underneath, and I'm going to go ahead and glue that in. And right about in this area here, right around here where these wires are coming out, here I'm going to bring them out underneath, or maybe even cut a little notch in the side piece for those to run out of, and then this will then glue onto the side reinforcement. And I'm going to go ahead and power everything up and make sure everything is good and still working properly before I glue that piece in. Okay, so let's get some foam tack on this strip. So this went on really nicely. 45-degree angle all the way down. Little tiny notch for my wires to come out of right here. And here's my throttle wire. It's going to run right up through here. So once this dries, I will glue this down over here along the center of the fuselage area, and then the electronics will be fully installed. So now we have the electronics finished. You can see how the antenna, one leg is tacked down here, the other is tacked down over here. The exposed part of the wire, of course, is the active part of the antenna, so you don't want to put anything on that part of it. I have that tacked in, and so electronics are finished. Next, going to work on getting the landing gear attached to the fuselage. So what I want to do is these pieces that I have with the little holes I drilled for the push pins, one's going to slide over this side, and one is going to slide over this side. I'm going to have these glued with foam tack. I'm going to press them against there, but before I put the push pins in, I'm going to flip the plane over and try to make sure that the landing gear is level as possible. Not real happy with the way the landing gear goes together here. Not really happy with the landing gear much at all, which is why I'm going to use foam tack, because I can easily remove that back off to get the landing gear off if I don't want to use it. So when initially preparing the bolts that act as the axles for the wheels, need to get a little bit of non-permanent Loctite and a nice toothpick with a nice pointy edge. And do not want to get the Loctite on the wheel, but we do want get it on the nut to lock the threads in place. So you don't need a lot, just enough to, so don't want the bolt to come loose later, and you don't want to tighten the bolt so much that it makes the wheel so it doesn't spin on the axle. So just tighten it just enough. Just while I'm using the non-permanent Loctite to kind of hold it into place. So make sure it's not touching the wheel. Plenty of room to spin, but not too much play. All right, so that one's good. So one thing I noticed is this little this little nub that they had down here, which basically is kind of like a tail dragger, I guess. It was so short that it doesn't, when the plane has the landing gear attached, that it doesn't touch the ground. The end of the rudder touches the ground. So it would be tearing my rudder away to use the landing gear. So I added a little extra piece you can see of styrofoam, so that it will stand off the ground. I don't think this landing gear is going to be on the plane much. I have a feeling that the plane, if the plane's going to crash on its maiden flight, it's probably going to be simply because I'm using the landing gear. So I'm going to continue showing how the landing gear goes together and do my first flight with landing gear, but I have a feeling it's going to be coming off fairly soon after the maiden flight. So we're going to go ahead and finish the rest of the landing gear. We'll show that, and then we need to attach the vortex generators and put on a little bit of these Blenderm tape that they call hinge tape. It's actually kind of like a medical tape. We'll apply that into a few places, and then we will be ready for the test flight. So what's going to happen next is the little piece that's going to hold the wheel skirts, or wheel pants, needs to go on next. And remember, I did drill these out to the same size as the hole I drilled for the wheel. So it fits right through that hole, which is the same size as the hole in the landing gear strut here. So now I need a little bit more of the non-permanent Loctite. You could use permanent, I suppose, if you wanted to. I'm going to use non-permanent. And then put on the final bolt and then tighten it down. I should say final nut. This nut is definitely, again, difficult to put on because it's so tiny. So I'm going to tighten it down, but not too snug, because I need to be able to move the wheel pants. So that they align properly for when the plane is flying level. Okay, so that's pretty tight. Make sure the wheel still turns. It does. So I need to raise this up as it would be in level flight. I'm just going to use a few of these 1, 2, 3 blocks to hold it in the air, and just use the wings to know where it should be sitting when it's level. I'll bring this over here. So I want to put these wheel pants on such that there's the little holes in here, the guide holes. I can still use the push pins to line up with the holes in the little support, and then glue these on like so. I just want to make sure that when everything's lined up, that these are pretty much in line with the rest of the fuselage, so that when we're in level flight, they're not, causing drag by being too high or too low. So I'm going to go ahead and attach these on both sides and level them out as best as I can. So the landing gear is all together now. You can see the wheel pants, how they attach to the wheels. So the next thing we're going to do is going to apply the 2 vortex generators. Now these need to be cut down the center for this back piece Leave the front together, of course, and then those will plug into these slots. So I need to clean this slot out. The other thing I want to do, I talked to the folks, tech support of Twisted Hobbies, and they said you don't necessarily need to use the Blenderm tape, as the directions say, on the hinge seams. They suggested leaving them off until there's an actual rip or tear that you need to cover up, then go ahead and add the Blenderm tape. The only problem with that is when you put the vortex generator on, it's going to cover the piece, the area where the Blenderm tape would need to go on this side. So I'm going to go ahead and add a piece of Blenderm tape here, same place on the other side. Then I'm going to go ahead and add the vortex generators. So the other thing I'm going to do is put a piece of Blenderm tape at the seam right here on the rudder, just to make sure that the that joint doesn't become weak and open up. So now we need to balance the airplane and mount the batteries. I have two different batteries, so I'm going to use Velcro, at least temporarily, to hold these in place. I'm not sure if I'm going to cut a hole in the fuselage to put the battery through the fuselage, but for now, at least until I have it well balanced, I'm going to use some Velcro. And I'm using the sticky back Velcro. So go ahead and put some on my first battery, and then I want to try to find out exactly where the battery has to sit. I kind of already did a little bit of weighing up to get an idea where to put the strip of the Velcro on the fuselage. Now I need to see where the battery is actually going to sit. So I get some Velcro in the back of my battery. I'm going to have a second one, exactly the same battery. I'm using a 600 milliamp 30C battery. It's 2S. Recommended by Twisted Hobbies, and I asked them about using the 600 versus like a 450, and he said weight-wise the plane really wouldn't know a difference, so I'm going to go with the longer flight time, and I guess it probably will add a little bit of weight, but it shouldn't be too much. Now, the manual said that the center of gravity was 200 millimeters, which is the same as 20 centimeters, back from the very leading edge of the front of the plane. So I measured that out, and I put a little line across the, I wouldn't usually mark it up, but for the sake of the video, I'm marking it up so I can very easily tell where the center of gravity is supposed to be. And then I measured back from that point, from the area where I marked this, let's see, and I measured up to the front of the wing, and it came to right about approximately 73 millimeters, or 7.3 centimeters. So I went ahead and set my balancing jig and balanced it out so that the leading edge is going to be right at 73 millimeters. So let me So if you have a propeller that looks like this one, what you want to make sure is that this edge, this forward edge here, is going in the direction of your spin of the propeller. So the propeller is always looked at from the pilot's view. So from the pilot's view, it's going to spin clockwise. But what that means is if you're looking from the front of the plane towards the pilot, it's going to be the opposite direction, which would mean clockwise. So it's going to spin this way. So that's why this curved edge needs to be out. You don't want it this way. You need it this way. So for this particular propeller, this is the shorter side, which sits on the motor. The one that's a little longer sits in the front, coming to the front of the aircraft. Now I don't have the special tool that is made for putting these little rubber bands on. So what I'm going to do, where'd it go? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my screwdriver that has removable bits and has a nice little hole in the center. So that works almost the same way. So I'm going to put this propeller on. So I'm going to start with the rubber band on one side of the notch, and then put the propeller on, and then just go like this. It's a little bit awkward, but just kind of take it up, and oh, I missed. Let's try this again. It's always helpful if you have someone holding the plane for you while you're doing this. But it's not too hard. Just take it up. Okay, and that is on. Okay, it's a little easier if you're not trying to get the camera view in here. So I'm going to charge up my battery for the first flight, and one thing I had to do is create a special adapter for my Spectrum charger to be able to charge this battery, because it doesn't come with a standard connector. So I'm going to charge this up and we'll give her her first test flight. Now it's tracking way to the left. So I did a quick maiden just to see how the plane did, and there's a few things. First off, I noticed before I took off, good thing I really paid attention to it, the aileron direction and the rudder direction were reversed. So I had to go into the radio and change the ailerons and the rudder, the direction, so that they would go the correct way. Good thing I didn't try to take off with it like that. Always check that before you take off. The other thing is, as you could see from the little test flight, I tried taking off from the ground. It does not track straight. It wasn't easy to get into the air from the ground, and then anytime I land, whether it was on the driveway or trying to land in grass, it would just nose right over. So I think everybody else kind of has the right idea. The airfield is just to go without the landing gear. The landing gear in this plane is junk. The plane itself, for the short little maiden that I first, where I first took it up, was pretty good. It controlled really well. Definitely do not start your flight on 3D rates. And I think I'm going to up my expo considerably for the 3D rates. I think I had it I think it was 35 or 45%, and I'm definitely going to bring that up another 20% for the expo for 3D rates. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the landing gear, and we will give this maiden a try again. I will rebalance the plane as well once I remove the landing gear. So since the landing gear wasn't tracking straight, and there was no way to easily land it without just setting it down on a dime, and you can't land in grass, I just went ahead and removed the landing gear. It just wasn't worth the effort. So now I'm going to do just do belly landings. Plus, the being a tail dragger eventually would wear this little nub down, and I'd have to keep repairing it. So I thought, do what the other folks did at the airfield, just remove the landing gear altogether. So now we're going to go give her a fly and see how she does. So I love this little airplane. Get a test flight. This thing flies beautifully. It's very easy to control. And my first flight was in wind, and I purchased this plane to be a front yard flyer, and I learned pretty quickly that you need a little more space with that unless you're starting to verge on being a good 3D pilot, because it needs just a little bit more space than a front yard flyer. I mean, it's still 32-inch plane, and you know, if you're not a good 3D pilot, you might have something happen like this.
Well, that ain't coming out.
And yes, I know, my name is George, and I should have watched out for that tree. But that's the way it goes sometimes. But I love this plane. I would buy another one in a heartbeat. And it goes together a little squirrely compared to a lot of other planes. But in the end, this thing, it really flies great, so it's well worth it. Well, I hope you liked this build and review video for the Edge 540 from Twisted Hobbies. If you did, I just ask that you click like below, and if you'd like to subscribe to our channel, we're going to have a lot of other fun and exciting videos.